Hi everybody. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about late 1967 through the 1968 presidential election and how Vietnam played a pretty significant role in that. I hope everybody's doing well, staying safe. Hopefully we can get back here next year and actually teach in front of a group of students. But anyway, I hope everybody's being safe. So last week I kind of talked about the draft and the split in the country between generations, between hawks. Normally, or at least originally, the older generation, the World War II, the baby boomers, who were now obviously adults, and their children who were more on the Dove side. The hawks believe, again, you don't really challenge your government, especially during wartime. The Doves believing that the war was wrong, and that they were out there protesting against the draft, against the war, against the Johnson administration, and there was a bit of a split there. In 1967, the split was still fairly, substantially on the positive side for the hawks. About 70% of Americans almost viewed themselves as hawks, supporting the country, supporting the war effort, and those sort of things in Vietnam. Those numbers were going to change rather dramatically once we get into 1968. In fact, I know I've read that an overwhelming majority of Americans in 1967 viewed the Doves as being anti-American or disloyal to America. But again, that's going to change. Now, in late 67, the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, decided in November that he'd had enough. So he was one of the architects of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and he was one of the architects of the increasing of troops, I should say, during the Vietnam War every single year. The year 67 saw about 450,000 American troops in Vietnam, and the following year, 68, would be the high point of 550,000 troops. But Robert McNamara didn't stick around long enough to see that. He left in November of 67. LBJ puts a new guy in there named Clark Clifford, easy to remember, like a big red dog. And he asked Clifford, as the new Secretary of Defense, to study the Vietnam War and get back to him on, what's really going on over there. He felt he had a bunch of yes men around him. And he was right. Clifford did eventually, after I think 2 or 3 months, did get back to LBJ, saying that this, in his opinion, was an unwinnable situation in Vietnam. Well, heading into 1968, we have in the Western Hemisphere, in our country, we have our New Year's December 31st into January 1st, but in Vietnam, the New Year is celebrated over what is called Tet, T-E-T, and it is January 31st every year. And coming up to the Vietnamese New Year of Tet, the American military and the administration, along with the North Vietnamese, decided they would have a truce, a bit of a ceasefire, so the country could celebrate and bring in the New Year. Unbeknownst to us, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong decided to actually use that moment to have the largest counteroffensive mass-scale attack against American and South Vietnamese forces of the entire war. It is referred to as the Tet Offensive. During this offensive that would last almost 3 full weeks, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong militaries and troops would attack about 100 bases and American-controlled towns and things like that. I think it was 12 U.S. air bases. They also attacked the U.S. Embassy in South Vietnam. It did take 3 weeks for us to reclaim. We reclaimed every single place that was attacked, but it was costly. On our side, we lost 3,000 American forces over that 3-week period, so 1,000 a week, very substantial. We did, however, kill about 32,000 of the enemy. So if you look at the numbers, which General Westmoreland, the general on the ground, often did, the numbers showed victory, right? You had a 10-to-1 differential between casualties, between the enemy and American casualties. But psychologically, this was devastating. Back home, the American newspapers, the television channels every night, Walter Cronkite, and all that on CBS, they were showing what happened, and Americans started to believe that, this probably was an unwinnable situation, and we are being lied to. Why are we there? And it starts to change a lot of public opinion. So heading into the 1968 election, you have LBJ, who is, let's face it, fairly unpopular at that time because of the war effort, and especially right after Tet. The very first primary in America every 4 years during a presidential primary, the presidential primaries, is in New Hampshire. And LBJ, even though he was the sitting president, was actually going to be challenged from within his own party by a senator from Minnesota who was preaching an end to the war, bring everybody home, end it now, that it wasn't worth it. So he was more on the peacenik side of things, on the Dove side of things. His name was Senator Eugene McCarthy, and he had a lot of the young people supporting him. Heading into New Hampshire, you would think a sitting president, even though being challenged, would not face much opposition, but LBJ won 48% of the Democratic primary in New Hampshire. Eugene McCarthy got 42%. So it appeared that the writing was on the wall, that the Democratic Party was very split between, should we continue fighting this war the way it is, or should we just pull out and withdraw all the troops? March 31st, then, 1968, LBJ went on television and gave an address about what he was doing in Vietnam, and at the very end of it, stunning everybody around the country, including his own advisors, he decided that he would remove his name for nomination, and he was no longer seeking the Democratic nomination for another term as President of the United States. And this blows everything open. We just lost the Secretary of Defense. Now the president's, I don't want to say quitting, but he's not running for re-election at a time when we have 550,000 troops on the ground. So to replace that void, you have the Senator McCarthy people, but he's not very well known. So then Bobby Kennedy, Robert RFK, the former Attorney General of the United States, of course, John Fitzgerald Kennedy's little brother, who was a senator from New York, decided to throw the Kennedy name in, and he was running pretty much the same as McCarthy on ending the war on the Democratic side of things. Then you had the segregationist governor of Alabama, George Wallace, who was running a segregationist campaign. Surprisingly, he was going to do fairly well, to be honest with you. And then the Republican Party decided to go old school a little bit and bring back Richard Milhous Nixon. So Nixon is back in '68 running for the Republican nomination. It appears, based on how the primary is going on the Democratic side of things, that he may be going up against another Kennedy, but the vice president under LBJ at the time, Hubert H. Humphrey, Horatio is his middle name, 3 H's, also from Minnesota, he decided that he was going to run to continue doing what LBJ and the party, or I guess what their administration was doing. So it is very, very split. Now in June, after the Democratic primary in California, it appears that Bobby Kennedy may have a chance of winning the Democratic nomination. He just won California. They were heading to the convention in Chicago next week. I think it was the following week. But as Bobby Kennedy was leaving the stage at the Ambassador Hotel after the California Democratic victory, a Palestinian Jordanian named Sirhan Sirhan pulled a gun out and assassinated Bobby Kennedy. So there was another Kennedy within, a 5-year span who was assassinated. So heading into the Democratic convention in Chicago, it appeared that Hubert H. Humphrey had it locked up. So once they get there, you're going to have all the protesters of all the different sides and factions, liberals, the Doves, the McCarthy people, the former now Kennedy people. You have the Humphrey people who want to continue doing things. You have a group known as the Yippies, the Youth International Party. They're conservatives who are there to cause all sorts of issues. And the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 1968 turns into a made-for-TV moment. There are riots in the streets. There are riots in the convention hall. It turns into a very, very ugly situation. Well, Hubert H. Humphrey does get the nomination for the Democratic Party. George Wallace will run as a segregationist independent, and Richard Milhous Nixon will be the Republican. So when the actual election takes place, it's very close as far as the popular vote. You have 31.7 million people who vote for Nixon, 31.1 million people who vote for Humphrey. So very, very split there down the middle. And then you have 9.9 million people who vote for the segregationist. He won, George Wallace, he won, I believe it was 5 of the southern states. So Richard Milhous Nixon, who said he was going to win this war and he had a secret plan to do it, is the new president of the United States. 550,000 troops on the ground, 15,000 Americans came home in body bags that year. Next week, I have a little surprise. I'm going on location. Tune in Monday. Take care.